It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone.
Well, hello and welcome to Islands at War podcast. You're listening to myself, Keith Pengelly, and I'm also, of course, joined by co-host
Nick Lahure. Hi, Keith.
Hi, how are you on this sweltering evening that we're recording here in Guernsey?
Yeah, God, it was hot. I've been in London since Thursday morning. Boy, was it hot there. I talked at a private dinner about the occupation on Thursday night, which seemed to go down very well. And I was then herring around. I spent a day at the archives on Friday, but I also went to the Imperial War Museum and National Army Museum, and Churchill's War Rooms, plus fitted in a bit of time. Went for a couple of beers with Dr. Philip Blood, because he happened to be in London at the same time, and very kindly invited me along to go for a few beers with him and a couple of the other guys that are historians. Just a very, very pleasant evening spent in Wapping. And then I was actually out on the Saturday night with a couple of our listeners, Kerry Thomas and Carl Reed.
Yeah, I saw the photographs. Very good. Very good.
And then I mostly was just getting very, very sweaty in London walking around yesterday. So much so that in the end I thought, you know what, I'm just going to go to the airport about an hour and a half early because at least it'll be air conditioned. It was like 31 degrees.
Oh, no.
Well, I say no breeze. Where you found a breeze, it was a very warm breeze.
Yes, I found the same today when I was on duty at Fort Grey. The breeze that there was like a sort of desert wind. Anyway, we're going to dive back to the winter of 1942, or possibly the autumn. November 1942, Nick. Quite a lot to cover in this episode.
Yeah, we've got a lot of downed aircraft. We've got sorts of things going on. We've got a bit of a connection to the Great Escape. We're going to talk a bit about foreign workers, a bit of a blue on blue by the Germans, which resulted in a number of deaths. So yeah, we've got loads to talk about.
And the possible German Guernseymen, or the Guernsey German, as will pop up later in the programme, which is quite interesting. It's unresolved, but we'll talk about that. Anyway, straight into it now, Nick. Under items that concern civilian affairs, our diarist, Reverend Ord, writes that there is such a thing as a jersey shoe, which is to be introduced into Guernsey. It is specially constructed for children and has an oil-dressed upper of leather with a wooden shoe, protected at heel and toe with metal and rubber strips. It sounds gruesome, but presumably somebody in a Heath Robinson way has knocked this up in Jersey, and it's found to be very, very durable. So it seems to have migrated over to Guernsey.
Yeah, and part of the problem is they don't have the enough leather and other materials to make shoes properly. So they have to have these improvised. They're a bit like a clog.
Yeah, that's what a sabot, something like that. Yeah. I just wondered if my father had to wear anything like that. It's lost in the mists of time, I suspect. Okay, and we turn to Louis Guillemette. I'll just remind listeners that Louis Guillemette was a sort of liaison between our truncated government and the German High Command here, or part of the High Command here. Louis Guillemette writes that at the Feldkommandantur, German headquarters, in an effort to stop thieving, foreign workers who are not working during working hours, or not seen to be working during working hours, are being rounded up. And it seems that although they should be staying in labour camps when they're not working, it's possible they've let themselves or not return to labour camps and are living off the land. I mean, things must have been pretty tough to leave a camp and live in the wild, so to speak, in November.
Yeah, pretty difficult to do in Guernsey without getting caught as well. Possibly slightly easier in Jersey, although that a lot of the escaped workers ended up being sheltered by local people. So I don't know if that was the same sort of thing happened here. I mean, we're talking about the food here. Haven't looked at all of the 1,232 pages of documents I photographed at the National Archives.
I saw the number on the tweet.
I haven't looked at all of them because I was frantically trying to make sure that I photographed every document that I'd ordered up to have a look at, but I did have a brief look on the flight last night on the way back. There are a couple of accounts in some of the reports where they say, in the opinion of a couple of doctors, this was actually, aside from the winter of 44-45, the winter of 41-42 was one of the worst periods for lack of food.
41 into 42, because we're at the back end of 42.
Sorry, 42 into 43.
Into 43, is that?
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting my things mixed up. Yeah, 42 into 43, aside from then things improved a little bit, and then, of course, we had D-Day in 44, and then it all went horribly wrong.
Yeah, well, the other thing that we're noticing, going back and looking at the occupation month by month, is the appalling weather. Either it's unseasonable in the summer or just really bad in the winter. And, of course, people are feeling it more because of the effects of malnutrition and starvation.
It also has the problem of it completely screws up your crops.
Yes, indeed.
In a lot of occasions.
And sorry, we're going to add...
No, that's...
Talking of crops, Guernsey had exported, since the occupation started, Guernsey had exported tomatoes and was owed £24,000 in value in 1942. Now, going to our trusty calculator, Bank of England calculator, that is nearly £1 million.
Yeah.
I mean, that's incredible. So let's get this straight. Somebody owes Guernsey nearly £1 million for tomatoes that Guernsey has, in brackets, sold. But our government, the controlling committee, have requests that this be paid in seed potatoes instead of German currency. And you can see the reason. There's more than one reason for doing this. But Nick, do you know who actually owed Guernsey that money?
The Germans.
It was just the Germans. It wasn't like the French, the Vichy government or anything like that. It was
Germans.
Yeah. Okay. Do we know? Well, I suppose
they were getting them shipped off to France to supply their troops there. I was reading something about it just the other day. The real problem, which there was a lot of pushback on, was that the Germans insisted on exporting potatoes from both Jersey and Guernsey to France when they were badly needed here. Now, we've already talked over the last year and a bit of the occupation that they were already in short supply, and the Germans were basically
exacerbating
asking for a loan of potatoes on which never got repaid, or just blaming the potato farmers for not actually growing enough potatoes when they're basically just being stitched up.
Well, we'll see how that plays out in the ensuing months. Now, there's an interesting one that caught my eye here. I subtitled it "Irishman Returns," but Louis Guillemette hears of an Irishman who has been deported, and we should remind our listeners that people that weren't Guernsey born were deported to camps in Germany, detention camps in Jersey from Guernsey and Jersey. But an Irishman who had been in Jersey, he's sent back to Jersey. He reports that Channel Islanders are being held in southwest Germany and are receiving the same food as the German civilians, which was a lot better than Guernsey and Jersey people were receiving. And it seems that the Guernsey press actually sent a reporter to Jersey to interview him. He was a Mr. Dennis Cleary. I think you've got some stuff in this.
Yeah, I've looked at this chap before when I've looked at neutral citizens and what happened to them during the occupation. Now, the story with this chap is the Germans deported him in September 42, and in October 1942, the Irish chargé d'affaires in Berlin asked for reassurances from the German authorities that no Irish citizens had been deported. Now, they checked their records, and an order came from on high to release an Irish barman. Now, this guy it's the same chap, it's Dennis, and he's variously described as either being a locksmith or a barman in various different paperwork. So I think he might have had a couple of jobs maybe on the go. But this caused absolute panic in high places because they were like, "Oh, cripes, what have we done?" Well, because
Irish people were neutral.
Yeah, and they'd originally said to the Irish authorities that they hadn't. And then they got asked again, and it was like, Oh, dear. So it only took 9 days from when they discovered that.
And was he the sole Irish national?
Yes. And he was released 9 days later and released and taken back to Jersey, which is how come he ended up back there. Now, I've got a copy of a newspaper article as well, which is the one that Herbie's referring to. And in that, the newspaper reports that he was only back because he was ill and that he was in hospital, and not that he'd been deported completely by mistake. So that's quite an interesting one, because I suspect that was probably to do with the German censors.
So they were trying to cover their tracks by basically insinuating this guy was ill, rather than admit.
To be fair, he was interviewed in the hospital.
Well, that's what I find odd. If Guernsey were allowed to send a reporter over to talk to him, that seemed counterproductive.
So who knows? But yeah, they sent him back, although his stay in Jersey was to be, shall we say, short-lived. He came to the attention of the authorities in July 1943 and got sentenced to 3 months for failing to surrender a radio. And in June 1944, he got 6 months in prison for receiving 2 cases of stolen goods. He then promptly escaped from Jersey prison in August 1944 and was on the run for a little while, because he escaped from Jersey prison, not because of the conditions in Jersey prison, but he knew he was going to be deported to France.
So he's a little bit of a Jack the Lad, and not backward and coming forward and that. So yeah, there's this newspaper cutting. I know obviously the listeners can't see it. Is that from Jersey Press or from?
And that's from the Guernsey Press, I think.
Right. Okay. And then he also is saying that the deportees, when he was with them, they travelled from St Malo to Paris and Belgium, Holland to Germany. And we're going to look at when we get to September 2025, we're going to cover the deportees in a special. Yeah.
While we're at it, it's a good point to mention that Ollie Guillou had a great podcast series that I listened to as soon as it came out, and Ollie came to see us a while back.
He did an interview with us in this very studio.
He did indeed. The Guernsey Deportees is what it's called. And he's actually just put out the episode where he interviewed us. So if you go and search for that podcast, you will find it on all the major platforms. And he's a really, really nice chap. We had a great time chatting to him.
Yes, because he interviewed at length his grandmother, who it turns out I knew and worked with her many years ago. I had no idea that she was a deportee. Just goes to show what didn't get talked about.
Yeah, exactly. So recommend you go and take a listen to that.
Yeah. Right, we move on to seaweed. Seaweed, or vrac as it's known in Guernsey and probably Jersey, was we all know what seaweed is, but it was used by farmers to spread on the fields. It's a type of manure and a supplement for the soil. Plans to gather seaweed and distribute to the middle of the island, that's the middle of Guernsey, for farmers situated there. Lorries and petrol had to be put aside for this. But the gathering of the seaweed had been hampered by most of the slipways onto the beaches having been blocked up for security reasons. So they found it difficult to get access down onto the beaches. But then I think it's Herbie writes that later in the month, Lorray slipway is to be unblocked for 5 days. So what do they just draw barbed wire and tank obstacles across the slipways?
Some of them were. I've seen a photograph of one out at Lorray, which was just blocked with basically barbed wire.
That's probably the one then, yeah.
And it also had like danger mines or Acton mine on the thing. Now, there may or may not have been mines there. The signs sometimes didn't necessarily mean it was just there to put people off.
Okay, we move towards military matters now. We had quite a bit of air activity here, and Nick and I were just over a week ago. We were on a walk with Richard Hume, who owns the Occupation Museum here. He's got some wonderful artifacts there. And he was talking about this very gentleman who he knew. This is Spitfire pilot, Australian Spitfire pilot Amos. Can't remember his first name.
Norman
Amos. he was shot down and crashed in the Forest parish, which is just south of the airport on the southwest coast of Guernsey. And, well, there's quite a lot to... Do you want to talk us through this, please, Nick?
Yeah, so he was flying a Spitfire, which was called St. Austell, because as many were, Spitfires and Hurricanes were often associated with towns that had raised money or individuals that had raised money, and this one was St. Austell's Spitfire. And a German aircraft had attacked him, and he ended up shot down, landing at the bottom of the cliffs.
But it was a photographic reconnaissance, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was photographic.
And he was pretty high up. And I think, from memory, seeing that he'd actually been spotted from France, radar from France, I think, because he was very, very high.
Yeah, no, he was attacked a little bit away from the island. It was the damage that he received which caused him to crash here.
Okay. So he wasn't brought down by armaments on the island.
No. It was a German aircraft.
So by the time he reached that airspace, so to speak, he'd already been winged.
Now, he survived. He was found by a German officer and who prevented a couple of organisation TOD workers who were trying to give him a bit of a kicking, from all accounts, from what I've seen. And he was taken to the Happy Landings Hotel, which we stood outside when we were talking about this, which was being used by the Luftwaffe and greatly entertained by them for a number of days.
Yeah. He was driven around almost he was on a sort of island tour. I understand.
He got that, but then things went... Well, he was lucky that the Germans, they sent some men down the cliffs to go and have a look at the wreck, and for whatever reason, they didn't find the camera from it. So they didn't know he was on photographic mission. One German died because he fell down the cliff while he was trying to do that.
He was trying to recover the parachute, wasn't he?
Yeah, something like that. It was near the Goof anyway, which will be familiar to the local listeners. But after a few days, he was shipped off. I should have said it actually at the start. He was 140 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, and he actually appears. I've got a photograph of him which I can share.
Yeah.
Later on, I'll put this in a link to this in the show notes. But there's a picture of Norman Amos and a group of other POWs. Eventually, he ends up in Stalag Luft III, so Great Escape territory. Although I don't think he was one of the escapers. He certainly wasn't one of the ones that was killed by the Germans, one of the 50 that was killed by the Germans. And I had a look at the lists of those that took part, and I can't find his name on there.
But he became an accountant back in Australia. Because Richard's got quite a bit at the museum about him. Yeah. Okay, and I think there was another Spitfire down?
Yeah, so this is in Jersey. This story, there's quite a bit on. It was a Spitfire 5B of 131 Squadron, and it was hit by flak over France, and he crash-landed in a turnip field in Jersey. Now, the problem was the Frenchman who was flying it, pilot officer Bernard Scheidehau, I'm not really sure how you pronounce that name, he waited for the Germans to arrive because apparently a farmer would not give him anything to burn the aircraft. So he was captured when the Germans arrived, as was the aircraft. The Spitfire was recovered, it wasn't very badly damaged, and freighted to Germany, where the aircraft was tested in various configurations, and one of which led to it being known as the Franken Spitfire.
Oh, very good. Because
they tried it with German engines to compare the performance of the aircraft with an engine out of a ME-109. How did it handle, etc., compared to an ME-109 when it had the same engine in it. Unfortunately, he was one of the great escapers, and he was one of the 50 that was murdered by the Germans.
Now, when we think back to the film The Great Escape, to the factual parts of the film The Great Escape, they show captured escapees being let out of trucks ostensibly for a comfort break, but of course machine guns were set up, And it's pretty much, we think, exactly what happened, isn't it? Would he have been one of those, or was he amongst that, which was really a massacre, wasn't it?
Well, there were some of the great escapers who were taken in ones and twos in cars, and then let out of the car for a comfort break, as it were, and then were shot by the men that were driving them with their pistols. So, but I don't know exactly how he unfortunately was killed, but he was one of the great escapers that was killed.
Okay, now one of the things we also saw in sort of cross-referenced Reverend Ord's diary that I'm going to explain that in a second, but we also have our carpenter diarist, Mr. Sovery. Mr. Sovery, he makes an oblique comment in his diary about an employee of his seeing 7 coffins for Germans being taken out of a place called Lovell's, which I think was acting as a sort of undertakers. And I said to Nick before we came on air, I'm a little bit sort of, anything that I see about the war now in his diaries, I double check with Nick or get a second opinion on, so to speak. But Reverend Ord also talks about a German vessel with several high-ranking officers came to grief. Can you talk us through this? Because you mentioned this at the top of the podcast about a blue on blue.
Yeah, so what happened was one of the patrol boats was going between the islands. It was one of the harbour patrol vessels, I believe, was taking some a major general, a major, and then we're down to staff sergeant and lance corporals in between the islands, and they were machine gunned by a couple of E-boats by mistake. Now, Ambrose Robin records in his diary that 2 generals were killed, but I can't see that was the case from the stuff that I've looked at. I must actually look at Simon Hamlin's book, because I'm sure it's probably in there. But Major General Horst Christiani was killed as part of that.
So he's a Major General.
Yeah, and then we've got Major Bruno Bank, and then Staff Sergeant Ludwig Fürst, and then
some Lance Corporals.
Lance Corporals.
So are they still here? Are they at the cemetery at Fort George?
Horst Christiani still is, for sure. I haven't checked on the other ones, but I know I've seen that one up.
Well, if they all are, I can't imagine why they wouldn't all be here if one of them is here, and they're probably all together, I would have thought, in separate plots, but we can check that. Yeah,
we can check that, and we'll cover that one off next episode.
Okay, now you've made note here, Ambrose Robin. Yeah,
Ambrose and a number of the other diaries, so Lesotho in Jersey are a friendly builder's merchant manager, and Ambrose Robin here, who worked for the civil service. In their diaries, they both talk about an exodus of troops under 30 years old. Robin in particular says, on the 7th of November, more troops leaving tonight at short notice. I hear that no foreign labourers are now arriving, and the departures have continued throughout this week to be on a heavy scale. So, and troops under the age of 30 are warned to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. By other accounts, the news dished out to us in the newspapers is, to say the least, not the least amusing. But he says that all eyes are on German movements here. There appears to be a great change in their attitude. The strutting and flamboyancy is going, and they all appear to be more sullen, which certainly fits in with other stuff that we've seen.
Yeah, because presumably these troops under the age of 30, this is in response to the Russian front, what was happening out in Russia. But also, things weren't going very well in North Africa, I don't think, for the Germans at this point in the war. But this is primarily led by Russian front.
Yes, it's going to be Russian front.
Okay, and what's this we got?
Okay, so we got the impact of Operation Basalt. So Basalt might have been, the beginning of the previous month, but there's still, Ambrose Robin records that the Sark landing is still puzzling the Germans, who cannot conceive how it was possible for the British to do what they did without some active cooperation from the inhabitants. And the result is the Sarkies are being continually brought over in 2s and 3s for questioning, and lodged in the jail during those 2 or 3 days they're kept here. And there's also been a warning to civilians to avoid contact with foreign labourers and not to entertain their requests for food. That appeared in German notice that was published in the paper. He also talks about another thing that's happening in Guernsey, which is they seem to have intensified their search of houses for wireless sets, which it would appear to be down to 40 anonymous letters sent to the commandant by persons who refused to take a risk and now annoyed that others get BBC News and they don't. Sentence for this offence have recently increased from 3 weeks to 6. Now, we talked about Dennis Cleary. He got a much longer sentence, albeit it was slightly later on in the war, because he got 3 months. The troops had all been confined to barracks after nightfall, and they must sleep in their uniforms. That was an order that had been in place for pretty much the whole of November, started about the 4th of November, and this is entering his diary's 25th. The men are not pleased, and several have got into trouble for contravening it, but the order emanates from General HQ in France. So that's to do with basalt. They want them to be ready. They don't want them to be caught wearing their night shirts and a hairnet getting ready for bed. So they're actually making them, much more ready to, in theory, ready to fight.
Trust in Germans.
Yeah, again, this is Robin. He's heard a few stories, and he feels it's difficult to trust the best of the Germans. 2 men billeted with Leonard Gilbert at Sunray Road. They'd been in the house for nearly a year. One is very reserved, and the other has been most kind and friendly. And he has, shared, the kind one has shared their fireside chat during the evenings, been very pleasant. And as far as was possible in the circumstances, almost one of the family. The other evening, the Gestapo walked in and asked this chap, which is the door that is always kept locked, and pointed to the pantry door. Gilbert was then told to open it, and as he was suspected of having a wireless set, the door was unlocked and the pantry contained merely their small supply of food. The Gestapo left, and the German friend expected to resume his seat at the fireside, but Gilbert promptly told him to go to his room and not to dare to enter any other room in the house so long as he remained billeted on them. So clearly he'd pointed out the cupboard. Now, I should remind people, if you haven't listened to any of the earlier episodes, we didn't have the Gestapo here. That was...
It's a term that was applied.
It was a term that was applied to the German Geheimfeldpolizei, which were just like German field police.
CID?
Yeah, like they were like German field
German Sweeney
police. But they would have been easy to confuse with the Gestapo anyway, because quite often they dressed.
Yeah, they were sort of like Gestapo wannabes, weren't they?
Yeah, but certainly, there's one in Jersey that definitely was. He became known as Wolf of the Gestapo because he definitely, wanted to make it look like. And I'm not saying that they weren't as bad as the Gestapo. Certainly some of them, very much modelled themselves on the Gestapo. But yeah, it's interesting that this guy, just tries to give them up after a year.
Well, tying together the police and tying together whether the Germans had any humour or not, there's another piece related by Ord, which is quite amusing. I've sort of subheaded it, the zealous policeman. And this is about a Guernsey policeman. Ord relates a tale of a local policeman who used to hide in darkened gateways and try and catch local people hurrying home to get home as the curfew starts to run out. So apparently this chap used to hide and then try to apprehend people as they were rushing around. And on this particular instance, this policeman tried to apprehend a chap who was rushing to get home when a German patrol stopped the policeman and demanded his papers and kept him waiting so that the civilian could make good his getaway. So the German, whoever was leading the German patrol, had obviously sussed out what was going on here and wasn't particularly happy about it. So he held up the local policeman until such time that the civilian got away. And then apparently the German, presumably would have at least been an NCO, apparently the German NCO then said, now hurry up and catch your man. And this guy had hightailed it. So he knew exactly what this chap was trying to do. So he put a stick in this guy's wheel.
Although certainly I've seen plenty of accounts where people were arrested by the German police because they'd merely stepped off of their own property into the road and actually gone anywhere. They'd just stepped out off of their property.
Oh, well, now I'd assumed that curfew meant you didn't go out your back or front door, if you're in your guard. So you could actually be on your... That's an interesting point. What's the difference between a garden and a bit like for example, my garden here, okay, it's reasonably big, but like you just walk over there and there's a bloody great big piece of land I could have wandered into. That wouldn't have... Could a farmer have been sort of out in his fields?
He could do. It could be as long as they were adjoined to where he lived.
Yes.
He'd be no dice if he crossed the road or something like that.
Okay.
Be in big trouble.
I always assumed that curfew meant you really were confined to your house until the time.
For most people, but
most people are not going to really have anywhere to go, are they?
There was a guy in Jersey who got arrested just because he opened his front door and stepped onto the road. He was arrested there. I can't remember if we've spoken about this before, but there's another extreme on the whole police front, which is there's quite a lot of correspondence between the Feldkommandantur and the bailiff of Jersey, and to a certain extent to the bailiff here, and it's complaining about the police not saluting German officers, which they had been told they had to do. They had to salute German officers. The other complaint was that when they did salute, they were making comedy salutes. in a mocking fashion.
Yeah.
And this seems to go on for at least a couple of years, this correspondence. Every so often you find in the archive it's popped up again. They're really annoyed about what the policemen are up to.
Okay, we move on to an entry from Violet Carey. And Violet lives out in the country parishes, and she writes about going into town to do whatever. But primarily, there used to be a cafe here, and it certainly continued into the 1970s, called Lenuri's. It was in the middle of St. Peter Port, and people were using it as a little bit of a hub to exchange information. And Violet writes about being passed she's in town, and she's been passed a message on a piece of paper, which she daren't look at in the street. And she takes it into the Guildhall Library, which is the lending library, again in the middle of St. Peter Port. And she opens a big book and surreptitiously opens this piece of paper, reads the piece of paper. And the message is Montgomery's order of the day. I think Operation Torch, Nick?
Yeah, quite possibly.
In North Africa. And then Violet also writes about going to this Café Lenuri's to discuss the news in this little hub. And there appears to be a group of people that meet, and they really do have to keep a watchful eye out for possible, well, again, we've just established, we say Gestapo, but let's just say it's German plainclothes policemen. And they all share the news, and then she recounts that she leaves there to go to the local market. And during the war, there were lots of French people resident on the island, and Violet recounts that the French people in the market were all whistling, and she says it was like a market full of birds. All these people had heard this news, and it had given an uplift to everybody. And I like that little story.
Yeah, the libraries did feature as being places where you could get, if you knew which book to look in, you could get an edition of the Guns news sheet, which is Guernsey Underground News Service, or the Guernsey Active Secret Press. You could pop in and have a look at it. You could also go to Lloyd's Bank, and if you were known by the manager, he would pass you something to have a butcher's at. So yeah, it wasn't uncommon. Now, talking about it was the risky bit.
Yeah, it does sound a little bit hello, doesn't it? But,
it does. But I mean, they literally. I mean, it was pretty a good plan. As my understanding is, they distributed it to a number of trusted people, and then trusted them to pass on the information effectively, which is clearly better than just dishing it out willy-nilly. Because the Guernsey Underground News Service chaps were unfortunately betrayed, so that they did get caught, but they were betrayed by somebody who they thought who was an Irishman who they had known since before the war.
Yeah, well,
and who they thought was a friend of theirs, but for whatever reason betrayed them.
Friendship tested in time of war.
Guernsey Active Secret Press, though, never got caught.
No.
But yeah, you could go to Lloyd's. I know certainly Lloyd's Bank, the Guillory Library. I've been told the Prio as well, and then there were various other shops and things that you could go to where someone would pass on the information.
Well, we know that Ord had access to a radio, not in his home, but he was going, I think, to the Chilcott family and listening to a radio there. Continuing with Violet, she writes that this is really an odd one. And before I go into it, just remind listeners that we had this curious case, which we've not been able to tie up, whereby local women were seen talking to a German soldier. And it turns out they were all talking patois, Guernsey, as I've seen it written lately, indigenous language, which is a Norman French patois dialect. Very difficult to learn as an adult. For a German soldier to be able to talk it was, we were scratching our heads, and there was a sort of backstory that he had been working here and gone to Germany and been conscripted, and by the time he got to be posted to Guernsey, he found out his wife and children had evacuated to England. But we've not substantiated that. However, there's another little story that ties in with that, and I think we haven't got anything on at the moment apart from the rumour, but there was a battery near AA Battery, an area called the Corbière, which is on the southwest cliffs, and it turns out that allegedly that one of the German soldiers there is called George Falla. Now, it's very difficult to get a more Guernsey name than Falla. Possibly Lahiri would vie for it, or LePage, but Falla. So this is a German soldier called George Falla, and this soldier apparently says that his father had been a British soldier in the Army of Occupation in Germany following World War I. They were certainly there from 1918, I think, into the early 1920s. And it turned out that this German soldier, George Falla, his father, whilst he was in the British Army, had died and basically left him and his mother in Germany. And they'd grown up really stranded in Germany. He said that he was made to serve and would have been shot if he didn't. But we're going to have to see if we can track this guy down.
Yeah, I've tried, but to no avail so far. I certainly can't find anybody called George Falla listed in the German records. Now, that's not to say, it wasn't in part of the records that were destroyed. I've had a look on Find My Past to see if I could find a George Falla born in Germany.
Yeah, that's right.
Around the right time.
Yeah.
And I haven't succeeded.
Right. Well, we'll continue on that one because it is interesting, and it's a strange thing to have made a rumour up about. It seems to have some grain of truth in it. Excuse me. Okay, a little bit more on. Well, this is a rumour, and Nick will take over from me in a minute. But Louis Guillemette had heard from the Feldkommandantur, so he'd heard from the Germans. The High Command here, or the German command here, that a British plane is forced to land on Alderney and it was full of English newspapers. Now, I don't believe this for a moment, Nick. What do you think?
Can't find anything on this. And they weren't dropping newspapers over the Channel Islands at that point in time. They had been earlier on.
So we're not ruling it out then, is that right?
Yeah, I just can't find it. I've looked at the list of aircraft losses that I've got, and I can't find one landing on Alderney. There's a number of aircraft that go down near Alderney.
Yes, that's right.
But not any of the crew survive, and not anywhere the Germans would have been able to access the wreck.
Intriguing, though, because Guillemette is told in his sort of almost official capacity by the German senior officers here. So
yeah, but it could well have just been a rumour that's been passed on from Alderney.
Yeah. Again, of course, they'd have probably been wanting to celebrate a sort of what they would have seen as a win.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, of course, we have covered this, but Nick will give us a little resume. A Lancaster lands on Sark, coming back from a raid on Stuttgart. Now, we have talked about this before. In episode 19, we talked to Tim Osborne. it was really it landed on Sark because it thought it was the Isle of Wight. Is that right?
Yeah, and Tim does a great tour of Sark doing this. He usually runs it a couple of times a year. So I think if he's going to run it this year, I would imagine it will be in September. But it's a really good tour. The story is basically the captain of the aircraft was Eric Singleton and his crew. They were from 49 Squadron based at Scampton, so same place as the Dam Busters. They took off with 6 other bombers from their squadron to join the bomber stream of 200 aircraft heading for Stuttgart. They couldn't see the target due to haze and thin cloud over the city, but Eric and his crew managed to pick up the river and were able to get good fixes. So they got there just after 10 o'clock in the evening and began dropping their bombs. They turned around and, unfortunately, whilst they were trying to get clear, got hit several times by flak. Now, bearing in mind, this is a long way from Sark.
Yeah.
Just outside of Stuttgart. So they realised the situation was serious and deteriorating rapidly because petrol was leaking out of the ruptured tanks. And one of us had to be bomb. One of the incendiary bombs that they tried to drop had failed to drop and was hung under the bomb bay. And it went off whilst you got petrol leaking out of your plane. That's not good. That's not a good day, is it? So he immediately ordered 4 of the crew to bail out immediately. The navigator, flight engineer, and wireless gunner and bomb aimer launched themselves from the Birmingham bomber, 5 miles from Stuttgart. So they're in Germany. They're prisoners of war if they survive the parachute jump. Eric decided he was going to see how far he continued to fly the aircraft, and his 2 remaining crew, mid-upper gunner Eddie Pope and rear gunner Les Saunders, stayed with him battling the fire, and their efforts were rewarded eventually, and they succeeded in putting out the fuselage fire. And then, for whatever reason, it seems unexplained, but the engine fire went out as well. So the rear gunner got promoted to navigator.
So many thousand feet.
Slightly different job roles.
Yeah.
He was given the job of acting as navigator to try and find their way back to England. And what happened next was they obviously weren't going quite in the right direction. And in bright moonlight, Eric thought they had reached the Isles of Scilly. The rear gunner, however, thought it was the Isle of Wight. Now, they were low on fuel, and they had to make a landing and had to do it soon. So they approached from the south, skimming over the chimneys of houses, wheels up, and they landed into a field. The aircraft burst through a hedge and eventually came to rest in a second field. Now, that field is probably the only one you could actually feasibly have landed a plane in. If you tried it in any others, you probably wouldn't have survived.
It's still called Airplane Field, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, variously known as Lancaster Field or Airplane Field. Yeah. It's just up the road from the Seigneury. You used to be able to find bits of Lancaster in the hedge still, but I think it's pretty much all been cleared now. When I went out there with Tim for a tour, there was certainly nothing that we saw. I understand that somebody went up there back end of the last century and took most of it, but occasionally people were still finding bits and bobs, a bit of hydraulic pipe or something like that. But it had burst straight through. There is a photograph which I don't have a copy of, or actually I might have a copy of at home, of the Dame of Sark with some Germans having a picture taken just outside of the Lancaster wreck.
So what do they do? Just break it up and just throw it over the cliff?
No, just shoved it in a corner.
And then sort of what happened then?
And left it there, and gradually bits got taken away.
Right, okay. So
that's why there were so many bits left.
I see what you mean. I thought it was just when it sort of hit the ground. And,
it just got broken up and the bits put in the corner of the field.
Yeah.
They just basically shoved it in the top right of the field.
I've been in the field. I didn't like to walk across the field. Somebody's property, but I have poked my nose in there.
I went with Tim when we had permission to be there.
Yeah.
We also had the senior with us one occasion when we went, because I got hold of the senior of Sark, Christopher Beaumont, and asked him if he would fancy coming along and telling us a little bit about the Dame of Sark being there outside of it. There is a painting painted of the aircraft as well. So having thought that they were either in the Isle of Wight or the Isles of Scilly, they were a little disappointed to see when the figures running towards them got a bit closer that they were German.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, let's face it, they did pretty well, because they could well have ended up dead.
Exactly.
Blown to smithereens. But he actually went back to Sark. It was September 1992. So almost 50 years after the event, the then senior Michael Beaumont invited him back to the island and gave him a tour of the island, and a party took place as well. And as part of the tour, they went and visited the field where Eric had landed. And as the press cameras were rolling, this was for Channel TV, I think, Eric was telling his story, and then he heard a familiar sound. A Lancaster bomber that was due to take part in the Battle of Britain, displaying Guernsey the following day, flew across Sark and made over the pass.
Oh, that's right.
Field in his honour. And I have seen the film, and you just see him, the recognition in his face.
Yeah, that's right.
And he turns around and looks at it.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you don't forget the sound of a Merlin, particularly if you've been sat in Lancaster bombers for a period of time.
Yeah. Right, now you've got this interesting thing here, Channel Islands Monthly Review, which was a publication that was started up in the UK. We must do something on this as well with Steve Foote, probably. It was started up in the UK, and it gave Channel Island news of various types to Channel Islanders that had been evacuated to the United Kingdom. Not so much about what was happening on the Channel Islands, but what was happening in the community in the UK. But you've got something here now, something entitled Here and There. Could you just tell us a little bit like this?
Yeah, so they also used to incorporate in this column Here and There, which used to appear in it from time to time, which was just like little snippets of information. And this one is about diplomatic exchanges. It's in the November 42 edition of the Channel Island Monthly Review. And it says the following people have returned to England on the diplomatic exchange ships El Nil and Narkunda. Mr. A.J. Delamere, brackets Jersey, Acting Commercial Secretary, British Embassy, Tokyo. Major G.P. Parker, Guernsey, Military Attaché, British Embassy, Tokyo. Mr. I. Larouchetel, brackets Guernsey, Chargé d'Affaires, Shanghai.
Yeah, which was under Japanese control. Yeah.
So, it just gets back to this whole thing about Guernsey and Jersey folk get absolutely everywhere.
So these people have been exchanged. These people would have been in, let's say, Japanese custody, and the British would have exchanged, presumably, Japanese embassy staff.
Yeah.
That were caught in London at the point of Pearl Harbor. So this is nearly a year later then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, good to see Guernsey and Jersey people out and about in the world, and then coming back safely. Okay, right. Well, that sort of concludes it. But there's sort of going on. You've been to London to do your talk. Now, the book, we're very close now.
We are very close. It's going to be published at the end of August.
Yeah. And are you doing anything around that? You must be doing a book signing, appearances and things.
I will be doing something. I'm speaking at the We Have Ways Fest, which is Al Murray and James Holland's history festival, which is held near Silverstone at the Black Pit Brewery. If you look up We Have Ways Fest, but shove that into Google if you want to find out about it. It's great fun. It's 3 days of lots of speakers, etc. And I've been given a slot to talk about the escapees, which I'm really looking forward to. Potentially some other bits and bobs. coming out in the meantime. But yes, we'll see what happens. But I will be doing something for the launch of the book.
Yeah, and of course we'll have to get you on and to talk about the book in the way that we have interviewed Teresa Flem, and I'll be talking to her again this week about the sequel to her first novel, and then you've also spoken to Jenny O'Brien. So you've got to be the other side of the mic, so to speak.
Yeah.
Can you tell me truthfully, are you sort of, I know that there must be a relief in a job well done and it's finished and that, but there must be some sort of feeling that I can put it down and move on to other things now.
Yeah, a little bit of that, but I don't know.
I can't believe you're not working on other things.
Might be.
Yeah.
After all, I did go to the archives in London and take 1,232 photographs of documents. Yeah, I might be working. I've had another idea and I've run it past a few people, and particularly because I was just wanting to see what their take on whether it was a good idea or not was. But I can't say more than that at the moment.
No.
I might not go down that path just yet. I don't know. I might do something different.
And have you got any more tours coming up in the near future?
We're gonna.
You and Joe?
Yeah, Joe and myself are doing one for the Autumn Walking Festival, which is
end of September, I think.
Yeah, I think it is, isn't it?
It probably coincides with half term, so it might be in October.
Yeah, and it's a incarceration, fortification, and escape. So it's around starts at Bordeaux and all around that sort of area where a number of escapes took place from, etc.
Very good, very good. Well, my Family in Wartime tour runs every now and again, and that's been well supported. Now I'll have some other news on that in the next few months about where that's ended up going. Guernsey Walking Tours also run tours on. We'll be running tours on Sunday afternoons around the Liberation area, or rather the Quay and Port area, talking about the fortifications there. That'll either be myself or Dave Bartram taking those tours. And then our tours with Whedon's Gin kick off. Well, that's on a Victor Hugo theme. They'll be running certainly in July and August on Wednesday afternoons, and possibly if they go well, they'll go into September. So there's a lot going on.
A lot going on with you mentioning Victor Hugo. Actually, when I was in London, several people mentioned to me that they were fully aware of the fact that we were having 2027, that there was a big Victor Hugo celebrations going on, and that they were fully intending to come to the islands.
Yes, well, of course.
Which is not. It's nice that the news of that has already reached.
Yep.
Further afield, and they're keen to come.
Well, there's lots of reasons to come to Guernsey, and if anybody that has been interested in these podcasts, and we know you're out there, if you ever come, get in touch with Nick and I, and we'd love to see you and talk of things of mutual interest. You can get hold of us on occupied@gnetradio.com. That's occupied@gnetradio.com. Don't forget to support Gnet Radio. There's lots of music shows, etc., that you might like. Got anything else to talk about?
No, I think that's probably it for this month. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with, it'll be Happy Christmas, won't it? Actually, while I think about that, I saw something today that made me laugh. Is July too quick for having a Christmas thing?
Oh, don't. Yeah,
no,
we'll be talking about Christmas.
No. But I happened. I was driving past Sunray Park, and as you know, the Triangle Junction there.
Yes.
If you're facing Sunray Park, there was a whacking great banner saying something like "Go Crackers for Christmas" with a picture of a cracker, and here on the 5th of July.
Oh, you mean like a Christmas fair or something?
Yeah,
like that?
Something like that, yeah.
Well, I do remember my birthday is August the 9th, and I remember waking up one morning and had Radio 4 on, and John Humphreys was on the radio in those days, and in disgust he read out that there was an article in the Times that day on August the 9th that Harrods Christmas Grotto was opening on that day.
Good Lord.
So we'll be talking about December.
It just made me, I was like, am I seeing things?
No, I know.
But we will be, will be guilty of talking about Christmas in the middle of
In the
middle of July.
Yeah, well, it gets late early nowadays. Okay, well, we're going to love you and leave you. And as I say, get hold of us on occupied@gnetradio.com. Enjoy the weather. Bye for the moment.
Cheers.
7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb.